Tommy Chen pressed his face against the cold metal window of the transport ship, watching the alien world grow larger below them. The planet Zephyria looked nothing like Earth, with its purple oceans and golden continents that sparkled like jewels in the light of 3 suns. At 12 years old, he was the youngest human to ever set foot on this world, accompanying his mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been chosen to establish the first human research station here. The ship touched down with a gentle thud on a crystalline landing pad. Around them, towering spires of living coral stretched toward the sky, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt Tommy's eyes to look at directly. The air tasted sweet when they stepped out, like cotton candy mixed with ozone. Strange 6-legged creatures that looked like deer made of glass grazed nearby, their transparent bodies refracting the sunlight into rainbow patterns. "Stay close to me, Tommy," his mother warned, adjusting her translation device. "Remember, we're guests here. The Zephyrians have been very generous to allow us to study their world." Tommy nodded, but his attention was already wandering. Everything here was so different, so alive. The ground beneath their feet wasn't soil, but some kind of spongy material that glowed faintly blue with each step. Trees grew in perfect spirals, their leaves chiming like wind bells in the alien breeze. In the distance, he could see the massive palace of the Zephyrian Empress, a structure that seemed to shift and change shape as he watched, as if it were breathing. The research station was a small cluster of earth-built domes connected by covered walkways. It looked tiny and dull compared to the organic architecture surrounding it. Tommy's mother immediately threw herself into her work, setting up equipment and taking samples of everything she could find. She had warned him that he would be bored, but Tommy found the opposite to be true. Every moment brought new wonders. On their 3rd day, while his mother was busy cataloging alien plant samples, Tommy decided to explore a little further from the station. He knew he wasn't supposed to wander off alone, but the forest of spiral trees was calling to him. The melodic chiming of their leaves seemed to form patterns almost like music. He wanted to get closer and see if he could understand what they were trying to say. The deeper he went into the forest, the more magical it became. Floating jellyfish-like creatures drifted between the trees, their bodies glowing soft pink and blue. Tiny winged serpents no bigger than his thumb zipped past his head, leaving trails of silver dust in the air. The ground was carpeted with what looked like flowers, but when he knelt to examine them closer, he realized they were actually small creatures that opened and closed their petals like mouths, trying to catch floating spores. Tommy was so absorbed in watching these flower creatures that he didn't notice he had wandered into a clearing until he looked up and found himself face to face with something that made his breath catch in his throat. 3 creatures the size of house cats sat in a circle, but they were unlike anything he had ever imagined. They had scales that shifted color like oil on water, 4 legs ending in tiny claws, and wings that were still too small for flight. Their heads were elongated and elegant, with large eyes that held an intelligence that made Tommy's skin prickle. Baby dragons. There was no other word for them. They were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Their scales caught the light from the 3 suns and threw it back in patterns that seemed to hypnotize him. One of them, slightly larger than the others, raised its head and looked directly at him. Its eyes were like liquid gold, ancient and wise despite its obvious youth. Tommy knew he should run. These were clearly not ordinary animals, and his mother had warned him repeatedly about interfering with the local wildlife. But something about the way the creatures looked at him held him frozen in place. They weren't aggressive or frightening. They seemed curious, tilting their heads as they studied this strange new being that had stumbled into their clearing. The largest of the 3 made a sound, a soft, trilling noise that was almost musical. The other 2 answered, their voices harmonizing in a way that made Tommy think of the chiming trees. They were talking to each other, he realized. These weren't just animals. They were intelligent beings, probably as smart as human children. As Tommy watched, fascinated despite his fear, he noticed something that made his heart clench with sympathy. The dragons looked hungry. Their scales, which should have been bright and vibrant, seemed dull. Their movements were slow and careful, as if they were conserving energy. The smallest one swayed slightly as it sat, and Tommy could see its ribs showing through its scales. Without thinking, Tommy reached into his backpack and pulled out his lunch, a sandwich his mother had packed for him, made with protein paste and synthetic vegetables from their ship's supplies. It wasn't much, but it was food. The dragon's golden eyes tracked his movement as he unwrapped the sandwich, their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent. Slowly, carefully, Tommy broke the sandwich into 3 pieces. The dragons watched him with intense concentration, their heads moving in unison like flowers following the sun. He tossed the first piece toward the largest dragon, who caught it in midair with reflexes faster than Tommy could follow. The creature sniffed the food suspiciously for a moment, then devoured it in one gulp. The other 2 dragons looked at their companion with what Tommy could only describe as hope in their eyes. He threw them their portions and they ate just as eagerly. When the food was gone, all 3 dragons looked at him with an expression that made his chest tight with emotion. They were grateful, he realized. These magnificent, intelligent creatures were thanking him with their eyes. Tommy reached into his pack again, looking for more food, when a sound like thunder split the air above him. A shadow fell over the clearing as something massive blocked out the light of the suns. Tommy looked up and felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. Above him, descending like a living storm cloud, was the largest creature he had ever seen. An adult dragon, easily the size of a building, with scales that blazed like fire and eyes that burned with rage. This had to be the mother of the babies he had been feeding, and she clearly did not approve of finding a strange alien creature near her offspring. The Empress of Zephyria herself had come to investigate, and Tommy realized with growing terror that he had just made the biggest mistake of his young life. The Empress of Zephyria landed with a force that shook the ground and sent the chiming trees into a discordant symphony of alarm. She was magnificent and terrible, her scales shifting from deep crimson to blazing gold as her emotions surged. Her wings, spread wide in dominance and threat, cast shadows that seemed to swallow the light itself. When she opened her mouth, Tommy could see rows of teeth like crystal daggers, and her breath carried the scent of ozone and starfire. The baby dragons immediately scrambled toward their mother, making high-pitched calls that sounded like apologies mixed with excitement. They pressed themselves against her massive legs, seeking comfort and protection. But the Empress's burning gaze never left Tommy, who stood frozen in the center of the clearing like a mouse cornered by a cat. When she spoke, her voice was like rolling thunder, and somehow Tommy's mind understood her words even though she wasn't speaking English. The translation device his mother had given him hung uselessly at his belt. This was something deeper, a direct communication that bypassed language entirely and spoke straight to his consciousness. Human whelp. The words hammered into his mind with the force of a physical blow. You dare touch the sacred offspring? You dare pollute them with your alien filth? Tommy's knees nearly buckled under the weight of her rage. This wasn't just anger, it was the fury of a goddess, primal and absolute. The very air around the Empress seemed to crackle with energy, and Tommy could smell the acrid scent of ozone growing stronger. She was building up to something, some form of attack that would end his life in an instant. I didn't mean... Tommy tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. The Empress's head snapped down toward him, bringing her massive face within inches of his tiny human form. Her eyes were like molten gold, beautiful and utterly merciless. You did not mean... The mental voice roared through his head, making him wince and press his hands to his temples. The sacred bloodline has been contaminated by your touch. The young ones have consumed the poison of your world. What punishment could possibly be sufficient for such blasphemy? The baby dragons seemed to sense their mother's distress and began making soft, pleading sounds. They pressed closer to her legs, looking back and forth between their mother and Tommy, with what looked like confusion. The smallest one, the one that had been swaying with hunger, took a tentative step toward Tommy before being called back by a sharp sound from the Empress. Tommy's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. The Empress was calling her children sacred offspring and talking about bloodlines. These weren't just animals. They were royalty, or something even more important. And he had fed them human food, which she considered poisonous contamination. The cultural implications were staggering, and Tommy realized that what he had meant as an act of kindness had been interpreted as a profound violation. Please, Tommy said, finding his voice despite his terror. I was just trying to help them. They looked hungry. The Empress reared back as if he had struck her. Her scales shifted to a deeper red, and the temperature in the clearing seemed to rise by several degrees. Help them? You think to help the children of the divine flame with your crude offerings, you mock their heritage and call it kindness? Tommy could feel heat radiating from her body now, and he realized with growing panic that she was literally becoming hotter with rage. The grass around her feet was beginning to smolder, and the air shimmered like a desert mirage. This was no mere metaphor. The Empress of Zephyria was a being of living fire, and her anger was reaching the point where it might literally incinerate him. But even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run, Tommy found himself looking at the baby dragons. They were huddled against their mother now, but their golden eyes were still fixed on him. There was something in their gaze that didn't match their mother's fury. They looked concerned. It was impossible to read emotion in such alien faces, but Tommy could have sworn they were worried about him. "The little ones don't seem poisoned," Tommy said desperately, knowing he was probably signing his own death warrant but unable to stop himself. They looked better than they did before, stronger. The Empress's head whipped down so fast Tommy barely saw her move. Her face was now so close to his that he could see his reflection in her golden eyes, tiny and terrified. "You dare question my judgment of my own offspring?" "No," Tommy said quickly. "I just look at them. Really look at them." It was the wrong thing to say. The Empress's rage exploded beyond anything Tommy had yet experienced. The air around them ignited, not with visible flames but with a heat so intense that Tommy's clothes began to steam. The ground beneath the Empress's feet cracked and glowed like cooling lava. The very trees began to lean away from her, their musical leaves falling silent in the face of her wrath. "Enough!" The word hit Tommy like a physical force, driving him to his knees. "You will not lecture me about my children. Alien, you have committed sacrilege. You have violated the most sacred laws of our kind. The penalty is death by flame, slow and eternal." Tommy closed his eyes and waited for the end. He thought of his mother, who would find his ashes in this clearing and never understand what had happened. He thought of Earth, which he would never see again. He thought of all the wonders of this alien world that he would never have the chance to explore. But the killing blow never came. Instead, he heard one of the baby dragons make a sound unlike any they had made before, a sharp, distressed cry that cut through even their mother's rage. Tommy opened his eyes to see the smallest dragon, the one that had been weakest, stumbling toward him on unsteady legs. Its golden eyes were fixed on his face, and it was making soft, plaintive sounds that tugged at Tommy's heart. The Empress fell silent, her attention shifting to her child. The baby dragon reached Tommy and did something that made the clearing go completely quiet. It pressed its small head against Tommy's hand, seeking comfort from the very being its mother wanted to destroy. For a moment, nobody moved. The Empress stared at her offspring in what Tommy could only interpret as shock. The other two baby dragons looked between their sibling, their mother, and Tommy, as if trying to understand what was happening. Then the smallest dragon did something even more remarkable. It turned back to face its mother and made a series of soft musical sounds, not the random noises of an animal, but clearly structured communication. It was speaking to the Empress, defending Tommy in words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was crystal clear. The Empress's scales began to shift from red back toward gold, her temperature dropping as confusion replaced rage. She looked at Tommy with new eyes, not just as a violator of sacred law but as something her own child was protecting. Her voice, when it came into his mind again, was quieter but no less dangerous. "What did you do to them, human child? What magic did you use to bewitch my offspring?" Tommy looked up at the Empress, his fear beginning to mix with something else, a desperate need to make her understand. "I didn't use any magic," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I just saw that they were hungry, so I shared my food with them." The Empress's eyes narrowed and her mental voice carried a note of disbelief. "Shared? You shared sustenance with beings not of your species? This makes no sense. Explain this behavior." Tommy was confused by her confusion. Sharing food seemed like the most natural thing in the world to him. When someone is hungry, you feed them. That's what you do. What you do? The Empress lowered her massive head, studying Tommy with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "This is a law of your people? A requirement of your pack structure?" "No, it's not a law," Tommy said, surprised by the question. "It's just right. When I see someone who needs help, I want to help them. Especially kids, children. Young ones." The smallest dragon, still pressed against Tommy's side, made another soft sound. Its siblings had crept closer too, drawn by curiosity despite their mother's intimidating presence. The Empress noticed their movement and something flickered across her features, an emotion Tommy couldn't identify. "You say especially young ones," the Empress said slowly. "Why do the young command special consideration from you?" Tommy thought about it, trying to put into words something he had never really examined before. Because they can't take care of themselves yet. Because they're innocent, because... He looked down at the baby dragon beside him, its golden eyes trusting and warm. Because they deserve to be safe and happy and well-fed. All children do, no matter what they are. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her scales slowly shifting from gold to a softer silver. The heat that had been radiating from her body began to fade, and the scorched grass around her feet stopped smoldering. "You include my offspring in this category of children? Despite their alien nature? Despite their sacred heritage?" "Of course," Tommy said, as if it were obvious. "They're babies. They're hungry and small, and they need someone to take care of them. That's all that matters." Something extraordinary happened then. The Empress's expression changed completely, her rage transforming into something Tommy couldn't quite read. She looked at her children, really looked at them, as if seeing them through new eyes. When she spoke again, her mental voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "Show me," she said. "Show me how you—" "Shared with them." Tommy blinked in surprise. "You want me to feed them again?" "Yes, but slowly." "Explain your actions as you perform them." Tommy reached into his backpack again, grateful that he had packed extra food for his exploration. He pulled out an energy bar, unwrapping it carefully while the 3 baby dragons watched with intense interest. Their nostrils flared at the scent, and the smallest one made a hopeful sound. "First, I check to make sure the food is safe for them," Tommy said, breaking off a small piece and examining it. "This is synthetic protein and carbohydrates, basic nutrition that most carbon-based life forms can process. Nothing toxic or harmful." The Empress watched his every movement with fascination. "You analyze the sustenance for compatibility? This is wisdom I did not expect from one so young." Tommy broke the energy bar into 3 equal pieces, making sure each portion was exactly the same size. "Then I make sure everyone gets a fair share. Nobody should get more or less than anyone else." "Equal distribution," the Empress murmured, "even though the largest could easily dominate the smaller ones." "That's exactly why they shouldn't," Tommy said firmly. "The strong are supposed to protect the weak, not take advantage of them." He held out the first piece to the largest baby dragon, the one that had first accepted his food. The little creature approached cautiously, glancing at its mother for permission. When the Empress made no move to stop it, the dragon gently took the food from Tommy's hand, careful not to scratch him with its teeth. "See how gentle she is?" Tommy said, unconsciously using a feminine pronoun. "She could bite my fingers off if she wanted to, but she's being careful not to hurt me. She understands that I'm trying to help." The Empress's scales shimmered, cycling through colors Tommy hadn't seen before, deep blues and purples that spoke of complex emotions. "You perceive intelligence in their restraint." "Of course," Tommy said, offering food to the second dragon. "They're smart. They understand kindness when they see it, just like any other children would." The second dragon accepted its portion with the same gentle care as the first. Then came the smallest one, the one that had defended Tommy to its mother. This little dragon did something that made Tommy's heart melt. It nuzzled his hand before taking the food, a gesture of pure affection. "And you return their affection," the Empress observed, watching as Tommy gently stroked the small dragon's head. "You show physical comfort to a being that could grow to become a force of destruction." "She's not destructive now," Tommy said, marveling at how soft the dragon's scales were, like warm silk. "Right now she's just a baby who needed someone to care about her. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To know that someone cares?" The Empress was silent for a long time after that, watching her children interact with Tommy. The energy bar was quickly consumed, but the dragons didn't beg for more or become aggressive. Instead, they settled down around Tommy in a small circle, making contented sounds as he gently petted each of them in turn. "In our culture," the Empress said finally, "the young are revered but kept separate. They are sacred, untouchable except by their immediate family. To interact with royal offspring without permission is death, yet you touched them without hesitation, without thought of consequence." "I didn't know they were royal," Tommy admitted, "but even if I had, they were hungry. That's more important than rules about who can touch who." The Empress's scales shifted again. this time to a warm amber color that reminded Tommy of sunlight through honey. You would violate sacred law to ease suffering, even at the cost of your own life? Tommy looked up at her, no longer afraid despite her massive size and obvious power. Wouldn't you? The question seemed to hit the Empress like a physical blow. Her great head reared back, and for a moment her scales flashed through a rainbow of colors as she processed emotions too complex for Tommy to understand. When she spoke again, her mental voice was barely a whisper. Yes, I would, but I am their mother. You are nothing to them, a stranger, an alien. Yet you show them the same care that I would. Why? Tommy thought about it, watching the baby dragons play around his feet like oversized puppies. The smallest one had curled up against his leg and appeared to be falling asleep, a soft purring sound emanating from its throat. I guess, Tommy said slowly, because caring isn't something you only do for your own family. It's something you do because it's right. Because if we don't take care of each other, all of us, even the ones who are different, then what's the point of anything? The Empress stared at Tommy for what felt like an eternity, her massive form completely still except for the slow, hypnotic shift of colors across her scales. The baby dragons had settled into a comfortable pile around Tommy's feet, their soft breathing creating a gentle rhythm in the clearing. It was the smallest one's contented purring that finally broke the silence. Your words, the Empress said, her mental voice filled with wonder. They echo the ancient teachings of our most revered philosophers, yet you speak them as if they are simply obvious truths. Tommy looked up at her, still gently stroking the sleeping dragon in his lap. I don't know about philosophy. I just know what feels right. What feels right? The Empress repeated slowly as if tasting the concept. Tell me, young human, what do you know of our people, of the legends that surround my kind? Not much, Tommy admitted. My mom's research focused on plant life and geology. I know you're incredibly advanced, that your civilization is thousands of years old, and that most species consider you to be... He hesitated, not wanting to offend. Gods. The Empress finished for him. Most species consider us to be gods. We are beings of immense power, capable of reshaping worlds with our will. We have conquered death, transcended physical limitations, and accumulated wisdom that spans millennia. We are revered, feared, and obeyed without question. Tommy nodded politely, but his attention was drawn to one of the baby dragons who had rolled over in its sleep, revealing a small scrape on its belly. Without thinking, Tommy reached into his pack and pulled out a small bandage from his first aid kit. What are you doing? The Empress asked, watching with fascination as Tommy carefully cleaned the scrape with an antiseptic wipe. She has a cut, Tommy explained, gently applying the bandage. It's not serious, but it should be kept clean so it doesn't get infected. The baby dragon stirred slightly at his touch but didn't wake, instinctively trusting the strange alien creature who had shown her nothing but kindness. The Empress's scales shifted through a spectrum of colors that Tommy was beginning to recognize as deep emotional processing. In all my centuries of existence, the Empress said slowly, I have witnessed worship, terror, submission, and desperate attempts to win my favor, but I have never seen anyone treat my offspring as simply children in need of care. Tommy looked up at her with genuine curiosity. What do other species do when they meet your babies? They prostrate themselves. They offer tributes. They recite ritual prayers and beg for blessings. Some are so paralyzed by awe that they cannot even speak in my presence. The Empress's voice carried a note of something that might have been loneliness. None have ever simply sat down and shared their lunch. That sounds lonely, Tommy said, and immediately regretted his words. You probably shouldn't tell an all-powerful alien Empress that her life sounds lonely, but instead of anger, the Empress's scales shifted to a soft blue that reminded Tommy of twilight skies. Lonely, she repeated. Yes, I suppose it is. When you are worshipped as a goddess, genuine connection becomes difficult. The largest baby dragon had awakened and was now investigating Tommy's backpack with obvious curiosity. She stuck her nose inside and emerged with one of his pencils, examining it with the intense focus of a scientist. Careful with that, Tommy said gently, taking the pencil and showing her how to hold it properly. It's for writing, see? He pulled out his notebook and drew a simple picture of a dragon, adding little details that made the baby dragon trill with what sounded like delight. You create art for their entertainment? The Empress asked, leaning her massive head down to get a better look at the drawing. It's not really art, Tommy said, embarrassed. Just a doodle. But she seemed interested in the pencil, so I thought I'd show her what it's for. He tore the page out of his notebook and handed it to the baby dragon, who clutched it carefully in her small claws. She showed it to her siblings, and all three of them examined the drawing with intense concentration, making soft musical sounds that Tommy was beginning to recognize as their language. "They will treasure that," the Empress said, and there was something in her mental voice that made Tommy look up at her sharply. "You sound sad." The Empress's scales flickered through several colors before settling on a muted gold. "Do I? Perhaps I am. Do you know, in all my long life, no one has ever created anything simply for the joy of my children. Every gift, every offering has been given with the expectation of receiving something in return. Power, protection, favor. But you ask for nothing," Tommy shrugged. "What would I ask for? You're already letting me spend time with them. That's pretty amazing. Letting you." The Empress trailed off, and Tommy realized that he had said something significant without meaning to. "I mean, if that's okay," he added quickly. "I don't want to impose or anything." The Empress was staring at him again with that intense, unblinking gaze. "You consider their company to be a gift to you? Not the other way around?" Tommy looked down at the three baby dragons who were now playing a game that involved batting the drawing back and forth between them like a ball. Their joy was infectious, and he found himself smiling despite the strange intensity of the conversation. "Of course it's a gift," he said. "How often does someone get to meet real dragons? How often does anyone get to see babies this cute being happy and playful? This is like the best day of my life." "The best day of your life," the Empress repeated, her voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Because you fed my children and played with them." "Well, yeah." Tommy looked up at her, confused by her tone. What could be better than making friends with amazing creatures like these? "They're incredible. You're incredible. This whole world is like something out of a fairy tale." The Empress lowered her head until she was nearly touching the ground, bringing her massive eye level with Tommy's small human form. "Child," she said, and her mental voice was gentle now, almost tender. "Do you understand what you have done today?" Tommy thought about it. "I fed some hungry babies and played with them? You saw three young creatures in distress and acted to help them, despite knowing nothing about them, despite having no obligation to do so, despite the potential danger to yourself." The Empress's scales were now cycling through colors so beautiful that Tommy had to blink away tears just from looking at them. "You showed compassion to aliens who could not possibly repay you. You demonstrated kindness with no expectation of reward. You treated divine beings as simply children who needed care." "That's what anyone would do," Tommy said, though even as he said it, he remembered her earlier words about other species and their reactions. "No," the Empress said softly, "that is not what anyone would do. That is what you would do. That is what humans do. And it is the most extraordinary thing I have witnessed in 1,000 years of existence." The baby dragons had finished their game and were now clustering around Tommy again, seeking his attention. He absently petted them while trying to process the Empress's words. Around them, the clearing had transformed from a place of terror and rage into something peaceful and warm, filled with the soft sounds of contentment. "I think," the Empress said, her mental voice filled with wonder, "I am beginning to understand why the universe chose to create your species." The afternoon light from Zephyria's three suns was beginning to change, casting longer shadows across the clearing as Tommy continued to play with the baby dragons. They had moved on from the drawing game to something that resembled hide-and-seek, with the little ones taking turns hiding behind trees while Tommy pretended to search for them with exaggerated confusion that made them trill with laughter. The Empress watched every interaction with growing fascination. Her massive form now relaxed against the ground in a way that made her seem less like an all-powerful deity, and more like a mother enjoying watching her children play. Her scales had settled into a warm, steady gold that reminded Tommy of sunlight on wheat fields back on Earth. "Tell me about your homeworld," the Empress said during a brief pause in the game. "What is it like, this place that creates beings such as yourself?" Tommy sat cross-legged in the grass, the smallest dragon curled up in his lap while her siblings explored a fallen log nearby. "Earth, it's home. Blue skies, green plants, one sun instead of three. Lots of different climates and environments. And lots of different species." "Other species?" The Empress's mental voice sharpened with interest. Your world houses multiple intelligent races? Oh, you mean intelligent like humans? Tommy shook his head. No, just humans are sapient. But there are millions of other species. Animals, plants, fungi, bacteria. Earth is incredibly diverse. And how do humans interact with these other species? Tommy considered the question, absently stroking the small dragon's scales. Well, it depends. We share the planet with them. Some we keep as companions, pets like dogs and cats. Others we farm for food, though a lot of people think that's wrong and are trying to find better ways. We study them, protect them when they're endangered, try to preserve their habitats. He trailed off, noticing the intensity of the Empress's gaze. We don't always do a good job of it, he admitted. Humans have made a lot of mistakes, hurt a lot of other species without meaning to, but we're trying to do better. You feel responsibility for beings that cannot even comprehend your existence? The Empress asked. You protect creatures that offer you no benefit? Well, yeah. They have as much right to exist as we do. Just because we're more technologically advanced doesn't mean we're more important. Tommy looked down at the dragon in his lap, who was now making soft, contented sounds as she dozed. Actually, that makes us more responsible for protecting them, not less. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her colors shifting through thoughtful blues and purples. This philosophy, is it common among your people? Tommy considered this. I guess it's becoming more common. My generation definitely thinks about it more than older ones did. We're taught that all life has value, that diversity makes ecosystems stronger, that we're all connected. He smiled, remembering something. My mom always says that humans are the gardeners of Earth. It's our job to help everything else flourish. Gardeners, the Empress repeated, and something in her tone made Tommy look up. Not rulers? Not dominators? No, gardeners. We're supposed to help things grow, not control them or use them up. Tommy gently adjusted his position so the sleeping dragon would be more comfortable, though like I said, we haven't always been good at that job. One of the other baby dragons had found something interesting in the fallen log and was making excited chirping sounds. Tommy looked over to see her trying to extract what appeared to be a small, colorful creature that was stuck in a crevice in the bark. What she found? Tommy asked, carefully moving the sleeping dragon to a soft patch of grass before going to investigate. The stuck creature was unlike anything Tommy had ever seen, a being about the size of his fist, with crystalline wings and a body that seemed to be made of living rainbow light. It was clearly terrified, making high-pitched distress calls as it struggled to free itself. Oh, you poor little thing, Tommy murmured, kneeling down beside the baby dragon. Let me help. He reached out carefully, using his small human fingers to gently widen the crevice in the bark. The crystalline creature's struggles increased for a moment, but then it seemed to realize that Tommy was helping rather than harming. It held still as he worked to free it, its large, multifaceted eyes fixed on his face. There we go, Tommy said softly as the creature came free. It perched on his palm for a moment, wings fluttering as it recovered from its ordeal. Then, to Tommy's delight, it made a sound like tiny wind chimes before taking flight, circling the clearing once in what looked like gratitude before disappearing into the forest. When Tommy looked up, he found the Empress staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Her scales were cycling through colors so rapidly that they seemed to blur together. You freed it, she said, her mental voice filled with something that might have been wonder. Of course I freed it. It was stuck and scared. Tommy returned to his spot and the smallest dragon immediately climbed back into his lap. The baby dragon found it, but she was too big to get it out safely. Good teamwork, right? He gently petted the dragon who had made the discovery, praising her for her compassion. That creature, the Empress said slowly, is what your people would call a pest. They eat the nectar from sacred flowering trees. Most species consider them vermin, Tommy frowned. So, it was just trying to live its life. Everything has to eat something. And it was beautiful. Did you see how its wings caught the light? You saw beauty in a pest. You felt compassion for vermin. You risked potential injury to save a creature that offers you nothing. The Empress's scales had now settled into a deep purple that seemed to pulse with emotion. Child, in all my centuries, I have met representatives of thousands of species across the galaxy. Each one defined themselves by their achievements, their power, their conquests. But you define yourself by your care for others. Tommy was getting embarrassed by all this attention. I'm not special. Any human would have done the same thing. Any human, the Empress repeated. Yes, I am beginning to believe that is true. And that, young one, is what makes your species the most remarkable I have ever encountered. The baby dragons had all gathered around Tommy now, drawn by the calm energy he radiated. They formed a small circle with him at the center, like flowers turning toward the sun. The sight of it, this tiny human child surrounded by creatures that would one day be among the most powerful beings in the galaxy, all of them simply content to be together, seemed to affect the Empress profoundly. Tell me, she said, her mental voice now almost reverent. What do humans dream of? What do you hope to achieve among the stars? Tommy thought about it, watching the play of light through the strange alien trees. I think we just want to learn. To explore and discover new things, meet new people, understand how everything works, and maybe help where we can, make things better. To help, the Empress said. Even species you have never met? Even beings who might see you as inferior or alien? Especially then, Tommy said firmly. The best kind of help is the kind you give to people who can't repay you. That's when you know you're doing it for the right reasons. The Empress closed her eyes, and for a moment the clearing was filled with such profound silence that Tommy could hear the distant chiming of the spiral trees. When she opened them again, her scales had become something Tommy had never seen before. A pure, radiant white that seemed to glow with inner light. Young human, she said, and her mental voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. I believe your species may be the answer to a question I have been asking for 1,000 years. The peaceful afternoon was shattered by a sound that made every creature in the clearing freeze in terror. A deep, echoing roar that seemed to come from the very heart of the planet. The baby dragons immediately pressed themselves against their mother, their scales shifting to muted grays as they instinctively tried to make themselves invisible. The Empress herself rose to her full height, her radiant white scales darkening to a threatening crimson. Danger, she said, her mental voice sharp with alarm. Ancient danger. Child, you must leave this place immediately. But even as she spoke, the forest around them began to change. The musical chiming of the spiral trees turned discordant and then fell silent altogether. The very air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. In the distance, Tommy could see the trees themselves beginning to wither and blacken as if some terrible blight was spreading through the forest toward them. What is it? Tommy asked, pulling the smallest dragon closer to him protectively. The little creature was trembling now, her golden eyes wide with fear. A shadow drake, the Empress said, her mental voice filled with a dread Tommy had never heard before. An ancient evil that feeds on life force itself. They were banished from this world eons ago, but something has called this one back. Her massive head swung toward Tommy, and her eyes blazed with desperate urgency. You must run, young human. Take your small form and flee while there is still time. But Tommy didn't move. He couldn't. The baby dragons were terrified, clinging to each other and making pitiful sounds of distress. The smallest one was still in his arms, her little body shaking so violently that Tommy could feel her heartbeat racing against his chest. I'm not leaving them, Tommy said firmly. You don't understand, the Empress said, her mental voice crackling with emotion. A shadow drake can drain the life from any living creature in moments. It is immune to fire, to energy, to every weapon my people possess. Even I cannot guarantee victory against such a creature, and you are just a small, fragile being with no defenses at all. The sound came again, closer now, and with it came the smell of decay and death. Tommy could see something moving through the dying forest, a shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a living void that left nothing but withered husks in its wake. Then we face it together, Tommy said, surprising himself with his own calm. You protect your babies, and I'll help however I can. The Empress stared at him in shock. You would stay, knowing you will almost certainly die? Tommy looked down at the small dragon in his arms, then at her siblings pressed against their mother's legs. These weren't just alien creatures anymore, they were his friends. The idea of abandoning them to save himself didn't even seem like a real choice. Of course I'm staying, he said. They're scared. They need us. The shadow drake burst into the clearing like a nightmare made manifest. It was roughly the same size as the Empress, but where she was beautiful and radiant, this creature was wrong in every possible way. Its scales were voids in reality, seeming to devour light and warmth wherever they touched. Its eyes were empty holes that promised nothing but oblivion, and its very presence made the grass around it crumble to ash. The Empress immediately moved to place herself between the Shadow Drake and her children, her body blazing with defensive fire. But Tommy noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Where her flames touched the Shadow Drake, they simply vanished, absorbed into its void-like hide without effect. The Shadow Drake spoke, and its voice was like the whisper of dying stars. "Empress of light, still you cling to these worthless spawn? Still you pretend that life has meaning beyond the darkness that awaits us all?" "You will not touch them, Void Heart," the Empress replied, her mental voice ringing with defiance. "I banished you once before. I will do so again." The Shadow Drake laughed, a sound like breaking glass in an empty tomb. "You were stronger then, Firebringer, and you had the support of your entire clutch. Now you stand alone, protecting weak young ones who will only slow you down." "She's not alone," Tommy said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The baby dragons made sounds of alarm, and the Empress whipped her head around to stare at him in shock. "Child, no. Get back." But Tommy was studying the Shadow Drake with the same careful attention he had given to every other creature he had met on this world. There was something about the way it moved, the way it spoke, that reminded him of bullies back at school. Creatures that fed on fear and intimidation, that grew stronger when others cowered before them. "You're not as powerful as you pretend to be," Tommy said, his voice clear and steady. "If you were really all-powerful, you wouldn't need to threaten babies to make yourself feel strong." The Shadow Drake's empty eyes focused on Tommy, and the temperature in the clearing dropped by 20 degrees. "Insignificant meat creature, you dare speak to the Devourer of Worlds?" "I dare speak to a bully," Tommy replied calmly. "And bullies only win when people are too scared to stand up to them." The creature lunged forward with impossible speed, its void-like claws reaching for Tommy. But the Empress was faster, placing herself in its path with a roar that shook the very foundations of the forest. Fire erupted from her body with such intensity that Tommy had to shield his eyes, and for a moment the Shadow Drake was driven back, but only for a moment. The darkness around the creature began to expand, swallowing the Empress's flames and reaching out like grasping fingers toward the baby dragons. Tommy saw the smallest one, his little friend, directly in the path of that terrible shadow. Without thinking, Tommy threw himself forward, placing his own small body between the Shadow Drake's power and the baby dragon. The darkness hit him like a physical blow, and he felt something vital being pulled out of him, drained away into that terrible void. But something unexpected happened. Instead of being consumed instantly, Tommy found that he could resist the drain. Not completely. He could feel his strength ebbing away, but enough to stand his ground. The Shadow Drake recoiled in shock, its empty eyes widening. "Impossible," it hissed. "No creature can resist the hunger of the void." "What are you?" Tommy smiled, even though he could feel his life force continuing to ebb away. "I'm someone who cares more about protecting my friends than saving myself. And apparently that's something you can't understand or consume." The Shadow Drake pressed harder, pouring more of its terrible power into the attack. But something else was happening now. The baby dragons, seeing Tommy sacrifice himself for them, were beginning to glow with a light Tommy had never seen before. Not the gold of their usual scales, but something pure and white and utterly untouchable by darkness. The Empress saw it too, and her mental voice was filled with wonder and growing understanding. "Love," she whispered. "The light of love. It is the one force the void cannot touch." The Shadow Drake realized its mistake too late. The combined light of the dragons, powered by their love for the small human who had protected them, began to push back against its darkness. And at the center of it all was Tommy, still standing firm despite his growing weakness, his determination to protect his friends burning like a beacon. "This is not possible," the Shadow Drake snarled, but its voice was weaker now, less certain. "Love is weakness. Compassion is folly. Only darkness is eternal." "Then you've never met a human," Tommy said, and smiled as the light around them grew brighter still. The light that emanated from the baby dragons grew brighter and brighter, fed by something the Shadow Drake had never encountered before in all its eons of existence: pure, selfless love. The darkness that had seemed so overwhelming moments before began to shrink back, unable to maintain its hold in the face of such radiant compassion. Tommy felt the terrible drain on his life force lessen, then stop altogether. The baby dragon's light wasn't just pushing back the Shadow Drake's power, It was protecting him, forming a barrier of warmth and love around his fragile human form. The smallest dragon, the one he had protected, pressed against his side and made soft musical sounds that seemed to pour strength back into his weakened body. The Empress watched in amazement as her children, powered by their bond with this extraordinary human child, did something she had thought impossible. They were not just resisting the Shadow Drake. They were overwhelming it with a force it could neither understand nor combat. "No," the Shadow Drake snarled, its voice now high with panic. "This cannot be. Love is weakness. Compassion is folly. I have devoured entire civilizations that believed such lies." "Then you've never met the right civilizations," Tommy said, his strength returning as the dragon's light continued to surround him. "Maybe that's why you're so angry and empty. Because you've never experienced what it's like to care about someone more than yourself." The Shadow Drake lunged forward one final time, pouring all of its remaining power into a desperate attack. But the combined light of the dragons met it head-on, and for the first time in eons the creature of pure void screamed in pain. The darkness that made up its body began to unravel, not destroyed but transformed, turning from empty black to soft gray, then to silver, then to something approaching actual light. I don't understand," the Shadow Drake gasped, its voice no longer a whisper of death but something almost confused, almost vulnerable. "What is happening to me?" Tommy looked at the creature with sympathy rather than fear. Where before there had been a monster of pure malice, he now saw something that might have once been like the Empress, a being of great power who had somehow lost its way, consumed by loneliness and despair until it had forgotten what it meant to care for anything. "You're remembering," Tommy said gently, "remembering what you used to be before you decided that nothing mattered." The transformation continued, and slowly, incredibly, the Shadow Drake's void black scales began to show hints of color, deep blues and purples that spoke of sadness and regret, but also the possibility of healing. Its empty eyes filled with something that might have been tears. I was once like her," the creature whispered, looking at the Empress with recognition dawning in its gaze. "Before the great darkness fell across my world, before I watched everything I loved die while I was powerless to stop it. I thought if nothing mattered, then nothing could hurt me anymore." The Empress stepped forward, her own scales shimmering with compassion. "Voidheart, my cousin, I had wondered what became of you after your world fell to the plague. I searched for you for centuries. I hid in the darkness between stars," the former Shadow Drake said, his voice breaking. "I fed on despair because it was the only thing that matched what I felt inside. I thought I had forgotten how to feel anything else." Tommy walked slowly toward the transformed creature, ignoring the Empress's sounds of alarm. The baby dragons followed him, their light still shining but now gentle and welcoming rather than defensive. When he reached the creature, Tommy did something that stunned everyone present. He reached out and gently touched one of its newly colored scales. "Feeling sad doesn't mean you have to stop caring," Tommy said softly. "It just means you loved something enough for losing it to hurt. That's not weakness, that's proof that you're capable of love. And if you can love once, you can love again." The creature, no longer a Shadow Drake but something new and healed, lowered its great head and made a sound that was unmistakably a sob. "Child, how can you show such kindness to one who moments ago sought to destroy you?" Tommy smiled up at him. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to remember what it feels like to hope." The Empress watched this exchange with scales that cycled through every color in the spectrum, her ancient heart struggling to process what she was witnessing. A human child, a small, supposedly insignificant being from a young species, had not only survived an encounter with one of the most feared creatures in the galaxy, but had actually healed it through nothing more than compassion and understanding. "Young Tommy," the Empress said, her mental voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for the most sacred ceremonies, "what you have done here today will be remembered for millennia. You have proven that your species possesses something rarer than any treasure, more powerful than any weapon." Tommy looked confused. "I just helped someone who was hurting." "Exactly," the Empress said, and now her scales settled into that pure, radiant white that seemed to glow with inner light. "You helped someone who was hurting, without thought of reward or recognition, without consideration for your own safety. You saw pain and responded with healing. You encountered hatred, and answered with love. The baby dragons clustered around Tommy, purring and nuzzling against him with obvious affection. The smallest one climbed into his lap and began making the soft musical sounds that Tommy had come to recognize as dragon laughter. The transformed creature watched this display with wonder in his newly clear eyes. "I have ruled for over 1,000 years," the Empress continued, "and in all that time I have sought to understand the purpose of consciousness, the meaning behind the universe's gift of awareness and emotion. Today, a 12-year-old human child has shown me the answer." She lowered her massive head until she was eye level with Tommy, her gaze filled with something approaching worship. "The purpose of consciousness is compassion. The meaning of emotion is empathy. We exist not to dominate or accumulate power, but to care for one another, to lift each other up, to heal what is broken and protect what is innocent." Tommy blushed under her intense stare. "Mom always says that's what humans are supposed to do. Take care of things." "Your mother is wise," the Empress said, "and your species, young one, may be the most important development in the history of this galaxy. You have the power to heal ancient wounds, to transform enemies into friends, to bring light to the darkest corners of existence." The transformed dragon spoke up, his voice now clear and strong. "I pledge myself to the protection of this world and its new human guests. I have been reminded today that existence has meaning, that love is stronger than despair. I will spend the rest of my days ensuring that others remember this truth." As the 3 suns of Zephyria began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Empress made a declaration that would echo across the stars for generations to come. "Let it be known throughout the galaxy that the humans are under my protection. Let it be recorded that they are to be welcomed on any world, aided in any endeavor that serves the cause of compassion. For they carry within them the rarest gift in the universe, the ability to see the worth in every living being, and the courage to act on that knowledge." Tommy, exhausted by the day's events, had fallen asleep with the baby dragons curled around him like living blankets. The Empress gazed down at him with infinite tenderness. Her rage from that morning now transformed into something approaching reverence. In the distance, alarms were sounding from the human research station as Dr. Sarah Chen discovered her son was missing. Soon she would arrive to find him safe and unharmed, protected by beings of unimaginable power who had learned from a 12-year-old boy that the greatest strength in the universe was a willingness to care for others. The age of humanity among the stars had truly begun, and it would be defined not by conquest or dominance, but by the simple act of a child sharing his lunch with hungry babies and showing kindness to all who needed it. The Empress smiled, her scales shimmering with colors that had no names, and began to plan how she would share this miracle with the rest of the galaxy.